I still remember the moment I stood in the courtroom that morning. The cold white lights were shining down, and I was holding nothing but a thin stack of papers in my hand. No lawyer next to me. No one representing me. Just the calm silence I'd trained myself to hold for months. Lucas looked at me like he'd just witnessed the funniest thing in his life. He leaned toward his lawyer, smirked, and made sure to speak loud enough for the whole room to hear. "She doesn't have a lawyer. She's only here to sign the divorce papers." A laugh slipped out from his family's side. A few people looked at me with a mix of pity and contempt. They believed Lucas, believed I was the timid woman who knew nothing about the law and couldn't defend herself. His lawyer gave me that same superior look, like the whole case had already been decided. Lucas stood there like someone who was already sure he'd won. His hands were in his pockets, his mouth pulled into a smug half-smile. He never would have guessed that the very sentence he used, the one he thought would embarrass me, would become the biggest mistake of his life. I stayed quiet. No reaction. No arguing. I didn't even look at him. There are moments when speaking only cheapens the truth. And I'd already decided the truth didn't need to come from me. It would reveal itself when the time was right. But to understand why I was standing there alone that day, with no one beside me, we have to go back a few months, when everything still looked normal from the outside, even though it had already begun to rot from within. I'm Mira. I'd worked in Lucas's family company for almost 10 years, handling internal finance. The job was never easy, but I stayed patient with it. I'm not the type who likes to show off. I observe well, quietly, and I do more than I say. My silence once made Lucas believe I depended on him. In reality, it was just the way I survived in a place where my voice was never valued. Lucas was born into a family with a long-running business. Everyone in his family believed they belonged to some higher class. They loved saying the company was a legacy, and people like me were only there to support it from behind the scenes. They treated me with polite, empty courtesy. I knew that well. And I also knew Lucas fully believed I'd never be strong enough to stand up to his family. His confidence didn't come from knowledge. It came from a lifetime of being indulged. In his eyes, I was someone who would always behave, always be there, always bend. He never understood that my quiet wasn't weakness. I just hadn't needed to speak yet. As time passed, Lucas showed more and more control. He handed me extra tasks, things that weren't supposed to be my responsibility. Thick reports, messy financial issues, unusual numbers. I did all of it, but he never acknowledged it. Even when I did well, he only said one short line. "It's nothing. You're used to doing that anyway." I heard him, and I stayed quiet. My silence made Lucas even more confident. He believed I'd never leave him, never go against him. In that marriage, he was used to being the one who decided, and I was just the one fixing his mistakes from behind the scenes. But somewhere in those long days, I started noticing small cracks forming. Lucas was irritated for no reason. He wanted every financial report sent through him first, even though that wasn't his role. He asked about things he'd never cared about before. Company expenses, account balances, internal invoices. He wanted full control, and he wanted me to do everything quietly. One day he looked at me and said, "Don't think you matter that much. You're just doing a job anyone else could replace." I only answered with a nod. I was used to him underestimating me. What he didn't know was that in those quiet nods, I'd already started keeping track of every detail, every number, every strange shift happening inside the company. I didn't say anything, but I saw more than he ever realized. Standing in the courtroom this morning, I let Lucas believe in that silence one more time. He thought not having a lawyer meant I had no strength. He didn't understand that sometimes the thing that destroys someone isn't a shout. It's silence that knows exactly what it's doing. I kept my eyes straight ahead, refusing to look at him. I didn't need to. I knew perfectly well. This hearing wasn't going to go the way he imagined. And when the truth finally came out, Lucas would be the first one to realize it. I didn't react in the courtroom, and I didn't react months earlier when I first walked out of his office. My silence made Lucas believe everything was still within his safe zone. He never understood that when I'm quiet, it means I'm watching very closely. Everything started when I found unusual expenses in the internal books. Numbers that didn't match, transactions with no invoices, and several operational costs that kept repeating with vague descriptions. I brought the report to Lucas and gently asked if there was anything that needed adjusting. He glanced at it for barely a second, then answered in a tone that was both lazy and annoyed. "Don't ask. There are things you don't need to know." That sentence wasn't loud, but it was the first sign Lucas was hiding something. Someone with nothing to hide doesn't dodge simple questions. I kept working, but this time with a different kind of awareness. And I started hearing more of the things Lucas usually said whenever he was irritated. "You don't understand how the company works. You should leave the big decisions to people who actually know what they're doing. If you leave me, you have nothing." He didn't say those things to argue. He said them to pin me exactly where he wanted me. Lower, smaller, more dependent. Gaslighting isn't always yelling. Sometimes it's the soft lines repeated just long enough to make someone question their own worth. I didn't question mine, but I remembered every word. Lucas's family was the same. They treated me like an unpaid assistant for all of them. They handed me reports from departments that had nothing to do with my position. When I finished the work, they just nodded, as if it was obviously my job. When I gave professional input, they ignored it or exchanged quiet laughs. I wasn't hurt by any of it. I just saw more clearly the place they thought I belonged. One day, when I checked a few secondary accounts Lucas had once told me not to touch, I found a large sum of money transferred to a woman I didn't know. Not once, many times, regularly. I stared at those numbers for a long time. Not because I didn't understand what they meant, but because I was trying to decide whether I even wanted to ask anymore. In the end, I asked anyway. Not because I expected the truth, but because I wanted to see how Lucas would react. He looked at me, leaned on the desk, tilted his head, and spoke with a condescending tone that was almost smug. "You think you have the right to question me?" There was no anger in his voice, just pure confidence that I'd stay quiet, that I'd accept it, that I'd keep playing the role of the reasonable wife who knew her place. And in that moment, I knew. Lucas wasn't hiding just one thing. He was hiding debt, hiding another relationship, and very likely using the company to cover money he didn't want anyone to see. I didn't say any of this out loud, but I started moving. That night, after Lucas went to sleep, I sat at the computer and backed up every piece of data. Nothing trimmed, nothing filtered. Every ledger, every transaction, every email, every archive file I'd ever had access to. I sent a message to an old friend, someone who studied auditing with me before I followed Lucas into his family's company. Just one short line: "I need to review some numbers, as soon as possible." She called me back within minutes. I sent her the data, keeping my voice as calm as I could. I didn't tell her about Lucas. I didn't tell her about his family. I didn't tell her about the suspicion growing inside me. I only needed the truth. And I trusted the numbers more than any explanation he'd ever give. A few weeks later, when I had gathered enough data to see a clearer picture, Lucas suddenly called me into his office. He stood by the window, arms crossed, looking like someone about to announce something he believed was important. "Whenever you're free," he said, his voice soft but cold, "we'll sign the divorce papers." I stood still. No surprise, no pain. I'd known this day would come. And maybe Lucas thought I would fall apart, or at least try to convince him to reconsider. But I didn't do anything. I just waited for him to continue. He looked at me, his eyes full of certainty. "And just to be clear, you'll be leaving with nothing. You have no claim to any of the company's assets or anything from my family." I stayed silent. He mistook my silence for acceptance. He didn't understand that this was the moment I saw him more clearly than ever. I walked out of his office that day without saying a word. Lucas believed he'd given me an ultimatum, and that I'd simply fall in line. But inside me, something else was rising. Not fear, but clarity. The moment he said I would leave with nothing was the moment I knew I needed to prepare. Not to save the marriage, but to protect myself and to finally end something that should have ended a long time ago. I didn't react. I didn't argue. I didn't shed a single tear. I just watched. And I started preparing for the one thing Lucas thought I'd never dare to do. That night, after Lucas told me I'd walk away with nothing, I sat alone in the small office at the corner of the house. I opened the backup files again, this time with a clearer purpose. I no longer saw them as just numbers. I saw them as footprints in a story Lucas thought I'd never be strong enough to trace. And little by little, the truth came into focus. The first thing I found was the gambling debt Lucas had tried to erase from the system. Transactions routed through 3 secondary accounts, then returned under internal expenses. He'd used company money to cover his losses, reckless and arrogant. People only do that when they're sure no one around them is capable of uncovering it. But I saw everything. Then I dug deeper into the emails. I wasn't invading privacy. I only opened the work accounts I already had access to. And there, I found a chain of messages between Lucas and the same woman whose name appeared in the bank transfers. In those emails, Lucas asked her to put several assets under her name. A newly purchased apartment, a few short-term investments, even a portion of the projected profit from the parent company. The wording was clear. He didn't want any of it tied to me. I read every line with my hand steady on the mouse. No shaking. No outrage. Just a feeling like a needle touching skin. Sharp, cold, and awakening. Lucas didn't just betray me emotionally. He betrayed the basic respect any person should have for someone who stood by them for 10 years. He wanted to cut me out of everything, even the things I'd helped build. But the more I read, the clearer it became that he was far too confident. People who underestimate others always leave traces behind. A week later, I met my old auditing friend at a small diner. We sat at a corner table where no one paid attention. She opened her laptop, went through the files I'd sent, and almost immediately saw the problem. "Mira, this isn't just accounting errors," she said, lowering her voice. "If someone decided to investigate, Lucas could be facing criminal liability, and the company would get dragged into it too." I just nodded, not surprised, not pleased to hear it either. I was only confirming what I'd already known. Things were far more serious than the threats Lucas tried to use against me. We stayed a little longer to review the cash flow. I used my own expertise to trace every transaction. Numbers don't lie. They just wait for someone willing to look. And for the first time in years, I didn't just see flaws in the books. I saw a strategy to leave this marriage without fear. When I got home, I started putting my plan together. Lucas thought I didn't dare to leave, but I'd been preparing in silence. I gathered all the real ledgers, the original documents Lucas didn't know I still had. I created a full summary of every irregular cash flow and analyzed each item. I saved everything in multiple places, with multiple versions. Nothing could disappear. Then I found a good lawyer, not to fight, but to protect myself legally. When I met him, I was very clear. "I want you to represent me, but I don't want you to appear in court for the first hearing." They were a little surprised, but once I showed them the data, they understood. If Lucas believed I had no one behind me, he'd get careless. His carelessness was the key. My lawyer agreed. We prepared the paperwork carefully. And he filed a sealed submission to the court at the exact moment it needed to be filed. Not early, not late. But the most important part wasn't the court. It was the audit committee and the IRS. I submitted the full documentation, anonymously of course, through the secure internal whistleblower channel. I knew they wouldn't react right away, but they would review it, and once they did, they'd see the irregularities Lucas tried so hard to hide. Everything was falling into place. As the hearing day came closer, I stood in front of the mirror to train myself for one thing: absolute calm. Lucas was used to seeing me soft. He was used to my lowered eyes, used to the fact that I never argued. He believed that silence meant submission. But on the day of the hearing, I would show him that my silence came from somewhere else entirely. I practiced my breathing, my gaze, the way I'd walk into the room without revealing a single emotion. I didn't need to look strong. I just needed to avoid looking afraid. And I knew that when I showed up alone, no lawyer, no family, Lucas would think he'd already won before the hearing even started. He'd talk a lot, and those words would become the evidence he never wanted to leave behind. Carelessness is always the weakness of someone who's too confident. 3 days before the hearing, I got an email from my auditing friend. She wrote just one line: "Mira, the IRS has opened a review on the company." I sat still for a few seconds, not because I was shocked, but because everything was moving exactly where I needed it to go. I turned off the screen, stood up, and the only thing left in me was clarity. Lucas believed I would walk away with nothing, but the truth was, he'd already placed his own hand on the board without realizing I'd been watching the whole game for a long time. All that was left was to wait for the right moment. And that moment was getting very close. The morning of the hearing, the room carried the same arrogant tone Lucas's family always had. I walked in first, alone. When Lucas saw me, the smile on his face appeared so fast it looked instinctive. He thought everything was still moving exactly the way he planned. I'd come to accept defeat in silence. He adjusted his collar, crossed his arms, and sat in the defendant's chair like someone certain he'd already won. His family sat in the row right behind him, backs straight, eyes full of pride, as if this was just a simple procedure to remove me from his life. No one looked at me with even basic respect. They were too used to the version of Mira who was quiet, predictable, and never pushed back. Lucas's lawyer stood up first, speaking in a steady tone full of confidence. He presented a proposal for dividing assets in the most disadvantageous way possible. No shares, no profit rights from the company, just a temporary, symbolic support payment. Clearly, they believed that because I didn't have a lawyer beside me, I had surrendered long before walking in. I stood there with my hands resting lightly in front of me, not reacting, not interrupting. That calmness only made Lucas feel even more triumphant, until the judge lifted his head from the folder in front of him. Before we consider the defendant's proposal, he said clearly, the court needs Lucas to explain several financial issues mentioned in the documents submitted by the plaintiff. The courtroom went silent. Lucas frowned. His lawyer tilted his head slightly, as if unsure he'd heard correctly. The judge continued. The court has received financial data, internal company records, and an audit report regarding irregular expenses tied to the defendant's business. I could hear a sharp inhale from Lucas's family. One woman pressed a hand to her chest. A man frowned and looked around as if trying to understand what was happening. No one knew where this came from. Lucas turned to me, panic in his eyes. What did you submit? I didn't answer. I didn't look at him either. I didn't need to. The judge turned to a new page. Here we have records of unexplained expenses routed through multiple subsidiary accounts. There are also personal transactions taken from company funds. And... He paused for a moment, his eyes settling on Lucas. Transfers made to an account under another woman's name. A wave of whispers rose behind us. Lucas's family looked around at each other, faces pale. The arrogance they carried shattered right where they sat. Lucas opened his mouth but couldn't make a sound. His lawyer hurried over, whispering urgently, asking about the documents, but Lucas only shook his head, lips trembling. He never imagined I still had the original data he thought he'd buried. The judge kept reading, each sentence landing like a blade. The court requires the defendant to explain the origin of the debts recorded internally, the use of company funds for personal purposes, and the intent behind real estate transactions registered under a third party. Every pair of eyes in the room turned to Lucas. No one was looking at me anymore. They were looking at the truth. Lucas stammered. Your Honor, I'm not sure about these documents. They're inaccurate, or being misinterpreted. The judge set his pen down, his voice steady but heavy. The documents submitted by the plaintiff include time-stamped verification and cross-check data consistent with an independent audit. These numbers cannot be misinterpreted. Lucas's lawyer was sweating, flipping through the pages like he'd never seen any of them before. He turned to Lucas, voice tight and urgent. Did you tell me about these transactions? About the assets under someone else's name? About... Lucas's eyes widened. I didn't think she still had this. I remained where I was, silent, not gloating, not striking back. I didn't need to do anything. Everything was unfolding on its own. Lucas's family had completely lost their composure now. His mother shot to her feet, face drained. Lucas, what did you do? You used company money to. His father's hands were clenched so hard his knuckles turned white. They understood perfectly well. If any of this reached the IRS or the audit committee, the family business was no longer in safe territory. And they realized something even more terrifying. I was no longer the woman standing behind Lucas, covering his mistakes. The air in the courtroom grew so heavy you could feel every strained breath. The judge finished reviewing the documents, then looked directly at Lucas. Given the severity of these irregularities, the court will forward this file to the IRS and the audit committee for an independent investigation. The process will begin immediately after this hearing. That was the moment the entire room fell into complete silence. No more laughter, no more arrogance, no more contempt pointed at me. Only Lucas, pale, hands trembling so badly he had to grip the edge of the table to stay steady. He looked at me, and for the first time, there was no confidence in his eyes, only real fear. A look that said one thing clearly. He had made a mistake he couldn't undo, and he knew it. Go back. I didn't say anything to him. I didn't need to. This silence wasn't submission anymore. It was the final answer to everything he thought he could hide. The hearing wasn't over, but the balance of power had already flipped. Lucas finally understood, far too late, that he should never have underestimated the woman standing in front of him. After the judge announced the file would be forwarded to the IRS and the audit committee, the entire atmosphere in the courtroom shifted. Lucas's family, the same people who sat proudly in the back row just minutes earlier, now looked like plaster statues that had suddenly cracked. They stared at Lucas with anger, disappointment, and fear, as if he were the one who had set fire to the very foundation of their family business. His mother tapped her husband's arm, her voice shaking. "What have you done to the company?" His father didn't say a word, but his stare cut so sharply that Lucas had to look down to avoid it. It wasn't a protective look anymore. It was the look of a man who had just realized the house he spent his life building might collapse because of one reckless mistake. In 10 years, Lucas had never looked as small as he did in that moment. Just 2 days later, the company called an emergency meeting. The board demanded that Lucas step aside from his executive role while the financial investigation moved forward. Temporary, but everyone knew it was the first step toward removing him from control entirely. When the announcement was made, one board member said openly in front of the whole room, "We can't let the company face risk because of one person's personal behavior." Lucas stood there trying to hold himself together, but his hands trembled. Calls from his mother and father came one after another. Not protective anymore, but full of blame, demands for explanations, demands for solutions. He didn't know what to fix, because what he damaged wasn't just the books, it was the reputation of his entire family. Lucas's mistress, the one who received the assets in her name, disappeared without a word. Her email bounced back as account does not exist. Her phone was off. She understood better than anyone, staying near Lucas now meant standing next to a disaster. Lucas was left alone with the evidence he never imagined I'd bring into the light. He looked like someone who'd lost his sense of direction, angry, scared, unsure who to blame. But what he was facing wasn't emotion, it was consequence. The divorce hearing resumed 2 weeks later. This time, I still didn't show up with a lawyer beside me, exactly as planned. I didn't need anyone to shake Lucas. He'd already done that to himself. Lucas's lawyer had changed his tone completely. No more harsh proposals. No more trying to strip everything from me. Now he spoke gently, trying to stay neutral, as if hoping to minimize the damage for his client. When the judge asked what I was requesting, I handed over only the necessary documents. No greed, no demands, no revenge through money. I only asked for what the law entitled me to, the fair share of assets and the rights I deserved after 10 years. Lucas looked at me, clearly surprised. He had expected me to strike back hard. He expected me to tear him apart, but I didn't. Sometimes indifference hits harder than any revenge. When the judge asked us to sign the divorce papers, I picked up the pen, signed my name, and said, "I didn't come here to beat you. I came here to end this." That line made Lucas open his mouth, as if trying to salvage whatever image he still had left. He lowered his head, his voice small. "Mira, I didn't think things would go this far. I just wanted things to be simpler." I looked at him. No anger, no contempt, just a calm truth. "You don't need to think that far. Just think back to the moment you laughed at me in front of everyone." Lucas froze for a second. No argument, no excuses. Because he knew exactly what I meant. That was the moment he pushed himself off the edge. When the hearing ended, no one from his family came near me. They were too busy dealing with the crisis Lucas had created. The company under review, the family's reputation cracking. Every look was directed at him now, and no one was standing close enough to carry any part of the fallout for him. He walked out of the courtroom, looking like a man who had lost his whole life without realizing when it happened. I walked a few steps behind, never looking at him. There was no reason to anymore. The sky that day was strangely blue. I stood on the courthouse steps and took a long breath. The feeling of freedom wasn't loud or rushed. It was light, but so clear that I knew I would never forget it. For the first time in years, I wasn't walking behind anyone. I wasn't someone's backdrop. I didn't have to stay quiet to keep the peace for someone else. All I had left was myself. And the certainty that calm can be stronger than any shout. When I stepped off the last stair, I looked straight ahead. I didn't look back. Only one thought ran through my mind. A simple, cold line that closed everything that had happened. He laughed because he thought I stood alone. But in the end, he was the one who had no one left standing with him. That's the end of the story. Thank you for staying with Mira until the last moment. If it were you, would you say she chose the right path? What would you do in her place? Share your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next stories. See you in the next video.